break a leg.
I want to thank everybody for joining us today in this, our third webinar presentation. It's great to have everybody here. We've had a really good response so far, and we're really excited about what we've got. A couple of housekeeping pieces before we get started. I just wanted to let everybody know we had a little glitch in the system last week, and so the evals didn't actually get sent out. Don't fear, we are still going to be issuing CEs. That hasn't been the smoothest process either, so we're anticipating that CEs for both last week's episode and this week's episode will go out over the weekend. But we have all your names, they're in our database, and we will ensure that we get them out to you. If you have any questions or comments or concerns, feel free to either post them on the Facebook page or you can send us an email at mercyair@airmethods.com, and we will do our best to get back to you shortly. So never fear, those CEs are coming out. As far as our session goes today, if you have questions or comments that you would like to pose to Dr. Archambeau, if you scroll over your view, you'll see down at the bottom there's a Q&A tab. If you can type those questions into the Q&A tab, we will be monitoring those, and then we will pass them on to Dr. Archambeau as they come up so that he can focus on presenting his presentation. And so that's about all I've got. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Archambeau. Thank you so very much for being here with us today.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. Let me see. Can everybody see my screen here and hear me okay? Yeah, Steve, you got me?
Yeah, it all looks good on our end.
All right, perfect. My name is Dr. Ben Archambeau. I'm one of the emergency medicine physicians at Arrowhead Regional Medical Center in Colton. And my background is that I did residency and trained there. I completed an EMS fellowship as well as a wilderness medicine fellowship there. And then along with that role in the department, I'm also in charge of the EM resident wellness program. So, you know, that's kind of what I'm going to be talking about along those lines today. Aside from the emergency medicine stuff and critical care, that's kind of my jam. So hopefully this lecture will be a nice, you know, easier, lighter topic for you, but something that you can walk away with some information, some useful, helpful pointers for you as well. So let's go ahead and get into it. All right, let's see here. Okay. So when we talk about wellness, this is kind of going to be an update on wellness topics that everyone's kind of heard of before, but where the modern thinking and the current science is on these topics. And it's actually changed more in the last few years than you might imagine in the year 2020, but kind of our overall framework and picture of what wellness is and how it's maintained and balanced has actually changed and continues to evolve. So one of the major topics that's come out over the last decade for sure is this idea that there's a mismatch between our base human physiology and our instincts and our base behavior and, you know, human nature and what our society is, or where we, you know, the kind of environment that we live in today. And, you know, you can group the negative outcomes of that into a category that's called diseases of civilization. And I expect that you're going to hear more and more about that as the years go on. And if you start getting into your own reading, I have a book list at the end that I'll throw out for you guys if you're interested in any of these specific topics. And then the other topic that you're going to see, if you look on the right side of the screen there, is this idea of chronic inflammation leading to most, if not all, of these diseases of civilization, or at the very least, contributing towards their progression. And so, you know, all of our favorite common diseases that have acronyms, from diabetes to cardiovascular disease, heart attacks, strokes, behavioral disorders, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, stress, fatty liver, different cancers, some more than others, and the kind of overarching term that kind of encompasses these is metabolic syndrome. And there's a medical definition of metabolic syndrome that does not include a lot of these topics. But the more that we look into this stuff and we understand kind of the science and the pathology behind it, and these new studies are coming out, one actually even just this week on Parkinson's disease, we kind of are starting to understand that these are actually probably a spectrum of diseases or manifestations of very similar disease processes that kind of stem from this disconnect and from this chronic inflammation that results. So the problem with this disconnect is fundamentally rooted in the idea that technology and society and population growth kind of drives us away from this fundamental lifestyle. But inherently, the technology itself and these processes are neither positive or negative. So as we'll get into a little bit later, you'll see that it's kind of how we adapt to these and realize the negative impact that these things have to overcome that is really what dictates how much this stuff affects us. So one really good example of this kind of disconnect from our understanding of what's going on and what's actually going on is the USDA since the year, I want to say 61 or 1960, has come out every 5 years with the dietary recommendations for Americans. And if you track the progress of those interventions, which talked about eating more whole grains, less saturated fat, low fat diet, all that stuff that you're used to hearing from dietary recommendations, you follow about 10 to 20 years out from that where, chronic poor diet kind of hits its effect. And all of these diseases have gotten worse since this intervention, not better. It's like the lag that happened after, physicians and certain medical bodies recommended certain kinds of cigarettes or saying that cigarettes were healthy in moderation kind of thing. And then 20 years after that, you see an increase in cancer, and then interventions against smoking 20 years later results in a decrease in cancer outcomes. So this is kind of the same thing, but we've proven again and again that these recommendations that they are putting out and re-emphasizing every 5 years are clearly not working because all these problems are getting worse. So then we got to figure out what the answer actually is. The good news is that, among other things, mental health focus has been renewed. A lot of mental health clinics and interventions have kind of been going by the wayside up until the last few years, and there's been a new focus on that and kind of a focus on how that all plays into your physical health as well, which I think is a really good thing overall. I'm not talking about safe spaces or being sensitive or offended or anything like that, but the idea that your mindset and your attitude towards all these situations can really affect the physiology as well. And so there are really changing tides in these thought processes and how we understand this stuff, that there's a lot more to these conditions like Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease. There's actually a gut connection in there, all kinds of stuff. And so we're going to kind of get into some of that stuff so that you can be a little bit more up to date and hopefully kind of incorporate it in your own life and your own wellness. So what am I talking about? You all know what modern society is. So the difference of the ancestral lifestyle, what people grew up and spent their whole lives immersed in for the last 2.5 to 4 million years at least, probably longer than that, but where we can identify that these are, in the modern sense, human beings, and this was their lifestyle, was a nomadic hunter-gatherer lifestyle up until the agricultural revolution, which was about 10,000 years ago, and the industrial revolution and the food revolution, which happened in the 50s. So you're talking about under 100 years at this point, some of these changes are happening. And that constitutes a fraction of a percentage of the entire evolutionary process and existence of human beings on the planet. So these changes are happening at a pace that's faster than we can really keep up with from a physiologic standpoint. So the ancestral lifestyle was defined by these characteristics. It was outside. There was no houses with air. There were no houses with air conditioning or heating or, bathtubs, hot running water. It was active. People moved all day, every day. You had to collect all your food, all your water. You had to go scavenge. You had to hunt. You had to move with herd migrations, inclement weather and seasonal patterns. And it was social too. People lived in small hunter-gatherer tribes that ranged from, a handful of individuals to probably no more than about 150 individuals in a group. And you'll see through even modern society and modern business or military structures, most groups that function well keep themselves under that size, about 150 individuals. It's hard to get to know people in a group larger than that, and it's hard to manage a group much larger than that effectively. So you'll see things kind of naturally get divided with those numbers, 6 to about 150. It was raw. We didn't cook all of our food. A lot of game was cooked over the fire. Some vegetables were, but a lot of it was root vegetables, herbs and berries that you could find and you could eat as you scavenged for this food. And it was exposed on a regular basis. People didn't have the same degree of coat clothing. They didn't have, goose down parkas. And they kind of had to deal with the weather that came along. And there's some evidence that actually shows that doing that kind of thing, being exposed to hot and cold environments without a lot of protection, not to a dangerous level, but to a degree that's safe, where you're not going to get frostbite, can actually train the smooth muscle of your blood vessels, and you become more hardy in those environments. It also increases your level of hot or heat shock proteins, which are kind of stress proteins that help your body deal with all kinds of stressful stimuli, even outside of cold, hot weather changes. And then repeated exposure to infection also made for stronger immune systems over time. Kids played in the dirt and no food was washed. There was no such thing as soap. Evidence out there seems to also show that there was a fair amount of downtime, more than we traditionally thought in these hunter-gatherer societies. Food was not abundant to the degree that it is now, but we used to have the mindset that these people were spending 24/7, hunting, gathering food, building fires. But whether it's, artwork or clothing manufacturing or cave paintings, there's a fair amount of evidence that shows that people had downtime, that they could be creative and social and rest on a regular basis. And then everything that we learned was through procedural learning. So you hear the medical term, see one, teach one, do one, or sorry, see one, do one, teach one. And that comes from, this kind of idea that that's how the human brain is programmed to learn. And so you learn by interacting, you see people do it, you try it, it's with your hands, it's not a PowerPoint like I'm giving you today. And that's kind of the fundamental idea behind the rest of the presentation, that we've got to address this disconnect and try and go back to a state a little bit where our body is capable of handling these stressors and these other issues that come up in a healthy and natural way. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about is stress. This is obviously a big one, especially with everything that's going on right now, from the election to pandemic to everything else. But stress in itself is neither good nor bad. It's simply your body's fight, flight, or freeze response. And that's, a natural thing that once your brain has decided that this response is going to be engaged, no matter what the stimulus is. It could be giving, a speech in front of a big audience on a stage. It could be a major test. It could be a sick patient on a helicopter. I mean, it can be any of these things. But once your brain has engaged this mechanism, it's mediated by your stress hormones, and you're strapped in for this ride. You're not going anywhere, and you're going to have this sensation of being stressed out, or being in this mode until those hormones are metabolized out of your system. And if it goes on chronically, that can be a real problem. So it was originally developed or evolved in human beings to deal with running from a lion, basically, or having to hunt your food, or dangerous things in our environment that represented either potentially high or moderate stress, but over a very defined short window, and then the stress was gone and you return back to baseline. The new stress is more low-level chronic stress about checking your Facebook or your Instagram. How many likes do I have? Is this interview going to get me the job? Am I, going to be able to pay my bill this month? Is, my review coming up this quarter? Am I going to get that raise? Like, all of these stressors are kind of unnatural and they're chronic. They never really go away. Stress also comes from different sources. How you adapt to it, obviously, is an internal one, but externally you have societal stresses, and that can be COVID, worried about the outcome of an election coming up. I mean, any of that stuff. And then individual stresses too. This is stuff that you encounter on a day-to-day basis. This is interactions with friends and family members. This is how you do your job if you have a bad case, anything like that. And then acute versus chronic is a big difference too. Like I said, moderate intermittent stress has actually been shown to be beneficial, where chronic low-level stress, which is more mediated by your hormone cortisol than it is by epinephrine, has a host or a series of long-term negative consequences that are generally avoidable. And so having this elevated chronically even at a low level really leads to a lot of negative downstream effects. So there's two kinds of stress generally, and a lot of it is not necessarily correlated to the specific stimuli that we're talking about so much as your mindset and understanding of the stress or preparation for it going into it, as well as how you deal with it at the time and how you look at it going back with your memory. So eustress, or positive stress, kind of ties in with this biological idea of hormesis. And that is an idea that all the way from viruses to bacteria to human beings to even at a societal level, moderate stress is actually one of the fundamental factors that creates growth and adaptation. So whether you're talking about bacteria becoming resistant to antibiotics, humans, beings getting stronger by lifting weights or working out or eating a better diet, or even societies tend to grow after stress, whether it's coming out with better adaptations for pandemics or anything like that. Some stress is actually good, and without any level of stress, you can't create growth. And that in itself has created a problem for people these days because people are not exposed to healthy levels of moderate and intermittent stress that then can go away and be reflected on and be learned from. Distress is chronic. It's going into it with a negative mindset, looking at things as obstacles, really things that are unnatural and are things that we're not adapted for. There's also this idea of post-traumatic growth that's being talked about more and more. So everyone's heard of post-traumatic stress and post-traumatic stress disorder, but post-traumatic growth is a thing too. And there's entire books and entire papers written on the subject. And I encourage you definitely to go learn more about it. But the idea is that if you have the right mindset about this stuff, and if you go into it and you are selecting the stressors that you're exposed to, whether that's going out and pushing yourself on exercise and going out on a hot day or going out on a cold day or in the rain to exercise, versus how many times you choose to check your Facebook or choose to check your email or choose to check the news in a day. All of those choices can determine how your body responds to this stress, whether it's a growth or kind of a chronic inflammation, chronic disease state. Okay, so how do we do that thing? How do we convert distress into eustress? How do we talk about going into it with the right mindset? So one of the major concepts behind that is something called cognitive reframing. And cognitive reframing is taking something that is generally or individually or historically seen as a negative thing and transforming it into something positive, both before, during, and after the event. So stress in itself is neither positive nor negative, but suffering is the subjective negative outcome of stress. Suffering is optional. Stress is not. You can't avoid any level of stress, but it's neither positive nor negative inherently. So one of the examples is being scared versus excited about something. So whether you are en route to pick up a sick patient from a hospital, whether you have to give a presentation or a speech, we have an interview coming up, the stress response that is induced by these thoughts and feelings and sensations and environmental cues is almost identical between being scared and being excited. If you think about it, think about something that you've been scared about doing or apprehensive about doing, and think about something you're really excited and worked up about doing. From a physiologic standpoint, it's the same mechanism. It's driven by your stress hormones. But if you're in the right mindset, if you can change your mindset and say, I'm not scared about this interview that's coming up. I'm excited to get this done. I'm excited to nail it. This is going to be fun. I'm going to come out of this strong on the other side. And if nothing else, even if I don't get the job, I'm going to learn from it. If you can switch that mindset, then going into it, you'll do better. You'll be in a better, more relaxed mindset during it and have better performance. And then after the fact, you'll naturally create positive memories from an experience as opposed to negative ones. Thinking about things as opportunities for growth and development versus obstacles. You're given a new job project, you have to move, you've got other stressful events that come up, annual reviews. It's an opportunity for growth as opposed to something that you have to overcome and get out of the way and get past. And that's going to help you deal with it better as well. This is a big one. So fixed versus growth mindset. And I struggle with this myself. And I really try and, do self-talk to get over this a lot. And a lot of people struggle with this these days. A fixed mindset is the idea that things in your life, events, situations, are out of your control, or you can't overcome them, or you can't improve, versus a growth mindset. So it can be whether you're lifting weights and you just can't get past this plateau, or you're trying to make, a time running, but you can't get under a certain time frame, to, you can't seem to affect a certain metric, or you can't remember to do a certain intervention. The idea that this is something that is just beyond your capacity versus this is something that you can overcome, whether you think you can or whether you think you can't, you're probably right. All right. And then just going into every single situation, no matter what the situation is, no matter how much it hurts or how stressful it is, just having the idea that you have something to learn. There is a lesson to be learned from every single situation that you're in, from every single person that you encounter, and from every single event or encounter that you have in your life, that there's something that you can pull out of it. If nothing else comes of it, you're going to learn a lesson. Okay. Another big concept that people have been talking about these days is mindfulness. So mindfulness is defined as a mental state achieved by focusing one's awareness on the present moment, while calmly acknowledging and accepting one's feelings, thoughts, and bodily sensations. So this is all about being here with what's going on, no matter how boring or slow or uninteresting it seems, and getting rid of all of those external distractions. I really try and keep my phone on silent as much as I possibly can. If I have something really important coming up, or a call that I'm expecting, or something else. I work with, part of my EMS job, I work with the Inland Valley SWAT team and the San Gorgonio Search and Rescue team. And we get call outs all the time. So those are on bypass. I have to hear those come through, but everything else can wait, right? If it's a phone call, if it's important, then I'll turn it on. But otherwise, people can leave a message, they can call back. In my mind, if somebody texts me, then by definition, it's not something that needs to be immediately addressed. If it was, they would call me. But just the idea of that you're present with what's going on, and getting rid of external distractions. So the benefits of this is that it creates an awareness of the mental and emotional states that are going on. And when you have that awareness, then it creates a certain level of objectivity. And that objectivity allows you to step back from the situation. If you're not aware that you're angry, or that you're upset, or that you're sad about something, and that you're emotionally compromised, so to speak, then there's no way that you can intervene on that. If you don't ask the question, then you will never find that answer about what's going on with myself. What can I do about it? It also serves as an emotional reset switch, whether that's an individual situation, or something that you're perseverating on at night trying to go to sleep, or it's a chronic low-level stress thing that's been going on in your life. Taking time to practice mindfulness and be present in the moment serves as a reset switch, where you can step away from that and just let those stress hormones, subside for a little bit, and you can move on cognitively to something else and then come back to it. It also lowers your emotional and physical baseline, your heart rate. They've demonstrated this over and over again, whether it's, Shaolin monks, or, people practicing different things, or martial artists. They've shown that, their resting heart rate and their resting blood pressure is actually lower after they've done things like meditation or practiced mindfulness in their own way than it was before. And this carries on beyond the actual time that you're spending on this, your mindfulness practice, whatever that is. It lowers it chronically and improves those two metrics. It also decreases your automatic response to stressful stimuli. So when something does come up, you're less likely to become overwhelmed by it. You're less likely to feel anxious or have this fight or flight response kick in. Or if it does, it kicks in less severely. Or if it is severe, then you overcome it and it gets ramped back down more rapidly. So overall, it allows you to meter your connection to the situation. It allows you to decide how passionate, how involved, how intense you want this to be, and how much you have to step back and see the 30,000-foot view, the forest for the trees, idea, and then go back and forth between those two mindsets to really optimize your response to a situation. And remember, suffering doesn't exist in the present moment. If you think about all the things we're suffering, yeah, things can hurt, things can be stressful, but usually you're immersed in a situation. The suffering and the stress that comes from it is usually coming from a negatively framed memory looking back on it. So realize that something can be, painful or stressful or difficult, but your mindset going into it and practicing mindfulness, being able to take a step back while this is going on, avoids that whole situation of suffering. Okay, so how do you actually do this stuff, right? I mean, it sounds nice. It's a little bit out there, sounds very, kind of hippie-ish medicine, but there's, if you look at the top left picture, Navy SEALs do this stuff and they incorporate it, and these guys don't incorporate anything that isn't effective. So the first and most superficial level of mindfulness is mindful breathing, or you may have heard of stress breathing or box breathing. And so the very basic form of this is a 4-second inhale, followed by a 4-second breath hold, followed by a 4-second exhale, followed by another 4-second breath hold. And you repeat that a minimum of 4 times. So if you can do this when a stressful situation comes up, and if you can do nothing else than remember to breathe in this pattern or slower when something is going, whether that's during exercising, during a mega code, during a speech, whatever it is, if you can engage in this, this will force your heart rate and blood pressure back down, and then force those hormones to, to a lower level, and you can actually decrease your stress level just by doing that. It's kind of a hack to your system. The next level up from that is mindful awareness, and mindful awareness is being aware of the situation that you're in, but not letting it personally affect your emotional or psychological state. So you're saying, I'm aware that there is pain, or I'm aware that this is a stressful situation. I'm aware that this phenomenon is going on, or it is, happening to me. I notice that I'm cold, but not being involved and not, focusing on that sensation. You're just aware of it, and then you let it pass. You objectively observe this phenomenon as something that is happening, not something that is happening to you. And then the most deep and the most difficult and intensive level of mindfulness is mindful immersion. And mindful immersion is defined as finding joy or finding purpose or meaning in situations that would otherwise be dull or boring. So mindful immersion is whether, finding your thing that is kind of a mindless task. So one example for me is I, have found that I actually kind of like gardening. I do a lot of high stress stuff in the ER and the SWAT team and search and rescue, and a lot of, intense situations that sometimes, pose a physical danger, just like, some people being on helicopters, it theoretically could pose a physical danger. But something like this that is completely the opposite. Or it can even be something like doing the dishes or reading a book, really finding joy in something that's otherwise meaningful or, boring or dull, and getting involved, being present in that moment, and really only focusing on that. Exercise is a really good one for a lot of people. There's this concept of the little red dot. It's just one example there's a golfer that I know that does it, a professional golfer, and some other pro athletes or, like Fortune 500 CEOs that actually have either draw on their hand or tattooed on their hand this little red dot. I actually use bracelets that I pretty much wear 24/7, but it's something that triggers you, or some people that you've seen wearing like a rubber band on their wrist, that triggers you to disconnect from whatever stressful situation you're in, return to that mindful, objective state. So having this little cue somewhere that you can use on a regular basis that is kind of non-obtrusive and, not necessarily going to be weird to the point that other people ask you about it all the time, can help you kind of get yourself in that situation when you're immersed in something that's really hard to disconnect from. There's also a lot of apps, online videos, YouTube, books, all kinds of things that can help you kind of get started with this stuff. All right, so the next one we're going to get into is nutrition. I really want to spend a fair amount of time on this one. I expect that some questions are going to come up with this too. I'm happy to even give a whole nother talk on this at some point, but this one's really kind of an intensive slide, and I put up all this information at the beginning because I want you guys to be able to take a screenshot or, jot them down real quick or take a picture of your phone. On the right-hand column, these are all books that are kind of written in the last probably decade for sure, maybe 15 years, but the most up-to-date books on kind of the, the new science of nutrition medicine. And it's because it's really different than what you're used to hearing. And then below are the first 10 studies that I think are relevant to this topic if you want to investigate a little bit more. But, I'm also in the process of building a website called ancestralhuman.com. And I'm going to be putting all this stuff out there where it's basically nutrition focused, but a wellness website that you can kind of access all this stuff and science-based, but, open source, so it's free to everybody that you can get more information on. But nutrition is kind of like my jam, so I do want to spend some time. And I think a lot of these diseases of civilization have a fundamental root in poor nutrition, which is the modern diet. So, or at least the standard American diet, which is SAD by its acronym. So, all right, so the primary fundamental principle, if you take nothing else away from this slide or this lecture, is that, you know, a huge part of wellness and how you feel and your energy level and avoiding these diseases of civilization is just eating real, whole, unprocessed food. So this can be as simple as avoiding anything that comes in a box or a bag or has a brand name to it, right? You know, shopping on the outside of the grocery store, shopping at farmers markets, you know, all that stuff, all that processed food contains things, whether it's high levels of sugar or these polyunsaturated fatty acids, vegetable oils that we'll get into in a second. You know, 95% of stuff in the grocery store that comes in a box or a bag contains one of these ingredients that's really, really bad for you. And when the factory or the company processes this food for you, then your body does not have to process it, and it's just easily metabolized, doesn't make your body work for the calories, and it doesn't provide the same nutrient content in the same mix that your body is used to seeing for the last 2.5 million years. So avoid foods that make health claims, especially the big one is anything that says low fat. If you own anything that says low fat, please throw it away. The issue with low fat is that it's either being replaced with vegetable oils, which are unhealthy, that we'll get into in a second, or more commonly, it's replaced with sugar. You have to have a physical content of food coming from somewhere, and there's only 3 macronutrients. Protein's expensive and hard to come by, and it's not as easy to process as the other 2. And then you've got fat and carbohydrates. So if you take out fat, it has to be replaced with carbohydrates, which are the basis of most of these diseases of civilization. It's the basis for insulin resistance, which leads to diabetes, metabolic syndrome, fatty liver, hypercholesterolemia, heart attacks, strokes, Alzheimer's, and Parkinson's. So, you know, sugar and insulin resistance is the baseline where all this stuff comes from. And when you take out fat, you put in sugar, it just, by its nature, is going to cause problems for you health-wise. All right, shop local. This is the difference between eating a banana that's ripened, you know, 7 days or 2 weeks since it was harvested on a different continent versus something that was harvested this morning to take to a farmer's market. It has a higher nutritional content, it's healthier for you, and less likely to, you know, spread infection if you don't have, you know, and then you don't have to cook it or process it as much either. Okay. So this is the big one. If you if you want to get interested in this and really make one single change in your diet that's going to help your diabetes, help your blood pressure, cause massive amounts of weight gain without making any other intervention, and, you know, can be practiced in a diet that is not miserable, it's this one. Avoid sugar. If you take sugar out and eat, you know, actually more fat instead, and minimize your grains, minimize the amount of inflammatory stuff that's going into your gut, minimize the amount of, you know, chronic low-level inflammation that is created in the process of these undigestible plant proteins, then you'll go a long way. If you avoid sugar, then everything associated with metabolic syndrome comes from insulin resistance. Insulin resistance comes from high levels of dietary sugar. So if you take that out of your diet, especially if you do it completely, then all of that stuff goes away. My wife is a family practice physician, and she has turned around completely multiple of her patients who have type 2 diabetes. She's gotten them off of all medication. She's lowered A1Cs from 13 to 6 in a matter of months, and all without the use of insulin or medication. My wife and I personally just do not start anybody on insulin. It's basically against our religion. So that's a big one. And as a result, if you're going to avoid sugar, therefore, again, you have to replace it with one of the other macronutrients. There's no way around that. So the answer to that is you have to actually eat more healthy fats, and that includes saturated fat. If you look at the 2015 dietary recommendations for Americans from the USDA, they completely removed their recommendations on limiting cholesterol, and they grossly lightened their recommendations on decreasing saturated fat. Cholesterol has actually not been shown with data to correlate to, well, dietary cholesterol does not correlate to blood serum cholesterol other than immediately postprandial. And then Dietary cholesterol also has not correlated at all to increased cardiovascular risk. There are no well-conducted studies out there that have demonstrated that. It just doesn't exist. This avoid cholesterol, avoid saturated fat that has been in the mainstream media and dietary recommendations for the general lay public for the last 40, 50 years has a lot of historical and political basis, but it actually does not really have an evidence-based background. All right, so if you're gonna eat more healthy fat, the one thing that you do have to do is avoid vegetable oils. And the vegetable oils are canola oil, corn oil, cottonseed oil, soy oil, sunflower oil, safflower oil, grapeseed oil, and rice bran oil. And the canola, corn, cottonseed, and soy, and sunflower, you'll see are the ones that are used in grocery stores or fast food restaurants almost universally. And these are the ones that are used for keeping processed or packaged foods stable. They also add some degree of taste, but they have every single one of them has been linked to increased cancer risk across several different kinds of cancer, increased ADHD, increased risk for Alzheimer's and development of diabetes. They are processed. They're not even really vegetable oils, which is why I put them in quotations. They're actually just polyunsaturated fatty acids that come from processing things like cottonseed oil, which historically was used to light street lamps in the 1800s. And then Procter & Gamble converted it to Crisco and marketed that as a replacement for saturated fat, even though before that, heart disease almost never existed and people were eating a lot of saturated fat. So vegetable oils have been linked again and again and again and again to negative health outcomes. Please avoid those like the plague, which is difficult to do if you're eating processed foods. Intermittent fasting, I'm sure everybody's heard about this, but intermittent fasting has had a lot of positive data behind it in the last 5 to 10 years. And that goes from everything from decreasing cancer risk to reversing diabetes and metabolic syndrome as well. The idea is that you lower your insulin resistance by having a low or zero level of insulin, well, it's never zero, but very low levels of insulin produced over at least an 18 to 24 hour period, and then reintroducing food. You also cannot avoid having less calories that way. You can't possibly make up for 4 meals and eating one, and your stomach is just not that big. But it also allows for processes in your body, your rest and recover processes, such as apoptosis, where unhealthy cells or precancerous cells or actually cancerous cells are targeted and destroyed. That doesn't happen when you're in an anabolic state, a fed state. So you have to be in a catabolic state. And it seems to be that the sweet spot for dropping into ketosis or an intermittent fasting where apoptosis takes place is at a minimum of 18 to 24 hours. There's several good meta-analyses out there that show that up to about 3 days has next to no, no negative outcomes, meaning you do not lose muscle mass, your energy does not dip. There's not really any associated negative health outcomes for fasting up to 3 days. And then people have also been shown to have benefits up to 7 days for sure, but anything longer than about 3 days just doesn't have a good volume of data behind it, so I can't recommend it with any level of certainty. And then meat. Meat is always the question that comes up, and there's a movie that just came out called Game Changers and all this other stuff that advocates for a vegetarian or vegan diet. Well, the problem with this is that there have not really been any studies that have been done at all that compare a vegetarian or vegan diet to a healthy, unprocessed, natural diet that contains meat. When they've done these studies, and you can talk about the Nurses Health Study or the Women's Health Initiative or the Mr. Fit Study or the China Study, I mean, there's a list of these epidemiological studies, but they're all retrospective, they're all survey-based. And so the quality of data behind those is very, very poor. It's the worst quality of data that you can get. I can't remember what I ate 3 days ago for lunch, and I'm not sure I know anybody who can. So when you give people a survey that says, how many times did you eat processed food? How many times did you eat sugar over the last week? People tend to exaggerate how well that they eat, no matter whether it's true or not. But there's not been a well-done study. Of the studies that have been done, there's a couple that are controlled trials, and they've not been able to show a difference. There's not been any correlation between eating healthy lean meat, well, sorry, not lean meat. It can have fat on it, but healthy unprocessed meat and increased risk of cardiovascular disease. The studies are underway. There's at least 2 or 3 that I know of that are being done. But you do have to remember that from a physiologic standpoint, human beings are omnivores. From a religious or ethical standpoint, it's a different argument, and I definitely understand those arguments. But you can't make a medical or physiologic argument behind vegetarianism or veganism. When you engage in those 2 diets, you at the very least have to pay very close attention to the macro and micronutrient content that you're eating. You can be a very unhealthy vegetarian who eats a lot of bread and sugar products, or you can be very healthy one who pays a lot of attention, but you have to typically supplement micronutrients, especially if somebody is vegan. And so from a physiologic standpoint, any diet that you engage in that you have to actively supplement or monitor calories and macronutrient and micronutrient content doesn't really make sense. Historically, people for the last 2.5 million years did not count calories. They did not take multivitamins. So the idea that the concept that you have to weigh your food, or that you have to take X, Y, and Z vitamin doesn't really stand up, because you would never evolve to a state where we have to do that. We would never evolve diabetes or hypertension or high cholesterol. People evolve away from that. People who have those conditions typically died off before modern medicine. So I got a question real quick. I'll take a just brief side step. And I heard somebody wants to talk more about fasting. And so, this is a big question that comes up. Talks about feeling hangry, right? Where it's hard to fast and you feel hungry. Sometimes even after like 2 hours, right? You eat breakfast and then you're hungry again. Well, this is all about becoming fat adapted. And I'm not saying that you have to go ketogenic. That's pretty unsustainable. To drop into ketosis, most people have to get below about 25 grams of carbohydrates per day. And that's really intense. That's like an apple and a half. So that's not necessarily feasible. You can have a lot of vegetables, but beyond that, people don't really eat carbohydrates on a ketogenic diet. And they tend to, get themselves into other bad habits trying to do that. But fat adapting is easy. Fat adapting is 100 grams per day or less for sure. And if you really want to get into it, you can drop yourself under 50 grams per day. But fat is inherently more satiating. You will go through the carb flu, so to speak, which is actually a physiologic withdrawal syndrome of carbohydrates and sugar, where your body is used to undergoing oxidation of glucose as its primary energy source in your mitochondria. You have to convert to beta oxidation in the mitochondria, which is your process for metabolizing fat. And new proteins literally have to be made and pushed to the surface of your mitochondria. And that takes about 5 to 7 days. And so until your body is capable of metabolizing fat at a much higher rate than it is carbohydrates, then fasting is going to be difficult. Not that it can't be done. Some people don't really have a problem with it, but if you fat adapt yourself first and you make it through that carb through that first 5 to 7 days, you feel fatigued, you feel cranky, your energy levels are low. But if you can make it through that, you'll feel better and better and better. And you really have to stick with it for a minimum of 30 to 60 days. The book on the right side of It Starts With Food is a really good one to start with if you're into that kind of thing, because it gives you an actual eating plan to go along with it. And I think there's a cookbook associated with it too. So that's a good place to start. But if you fat adapt yourself first, which kind of hits several of those points that we talked about above, that will make fasting a lot easier as well. And then with this diet, you can eat, a healthy meal that includes a big fatty, juicy steak. You can put heavy cream in your coffee. You can put butter on things and cook with real, ghee or clarified butter, that kind of thing. So it's not like a miserable diet. It's actually very satiating. And you can do modified fasts with putting butter or heavy cream or something in your coffee as well, which can push you a few hours further during an intermittent fast, but it does not stimulate insulin at all. And so that's considered a modified fast. And so sometimes if you feel hungry, just go eat something super fatty like that. Or, a really good one is coffee with some butter or cream in it, because that coffee also suppresses your appetite. Okay, so the baseline or the punchline of this slide and everything that you want to do is these are the fundamental recommendations for a healthy ancestral-based diet that goes back to what our physiology is made to do is that it has to be sustainable. It has to be something you can stick with. So if you're going to get rid of sugar, then you can't just eat veggies. You have to replace it with things that are healthy. And that is in the form of fat. And I promise you, you'll feel better. It's your hair and your nails and your skin will look better because they're all very cholesterol dependent to make. Every cell in your body uses cholesterol on the cell surface. All of your hormones use cholesterol as a basis, or at least most of the major ones do. And so you'll find a lot better hormone balance. Like, men tend to have better libidos and grow more hair. Women tend to have a better estrogen balance. And this is all because you're giving your body the cholesterol and the fundamental building blocks that you need to do it. There are no essential carbohydrates. There's only essential fats and essential proteins. You can live your entire life and not eat another carb and you'll be fine. Your body will make it through gluconeogenesis in the liver, and you'll have ketosis too, which can supply at least a third to 40% of your calories without a problem. So, it's definitely doable. And once you make it through that hurdle of the carb flu, and especially once you get through 30 days and 60 days, it gets easier and easier and easier. You feel better and better and better. And then you can do this for the rest of your life. All right. So don't restrict calories. That's the last point that I wanted to make. Calorie restriction is the basis for most of the diets, whether it's Jenny Craig or Weight Watchers or any of that stuff. And obviously they don't work because these diets have been around for decades and people are just getting fatter and fatter. So use the points above. It's closer to a ketogenic diet or a low carb, high fat diet. Even Atkins diet kind of gets there, but Atkins doesn't really get back to the unprocessed thing. They let you eat processed bacon, which is not necessarily healthy for you. So, but calorie restriction is not a thing. I eat more calories now on a fat adapted diet than I ever did before. I'm eating about 3,000 calories a day right now. And I'm down from my high school weight of 285 to 180 now, which is what I weigh. And I've been there for about a decade. All right, so real quick, any study that proves that increase in fats does not increase your chances of cardiovascular disease? Yes. So the number one study down there on this slide is one that does that. There's a Canadian study. The second one talks about this. Number two, the number 5 on this study talks about it. Number 6 on this study talks about that. And then there's ones that talk about using ketogenic diet or fasting for cancer. But yeah, if there's enough people interested, I have a list of, I think I'm up to 48 or 50 studies or something like that I've pulled on these different dietary recommendations. So if there is interest, Steve can let me know, and I'll send out those studies as well as a spreadsheet. I just wanted to kind of give you the heavy hitters on this page. Okay. So I won't spend too much time on this. We're getting a little bit close on time here, and I want to make sure that I leave a little bit more time specifically for questions as well. But gut health and microbiome is another big topic. It's one that we don't know a ton about yet, but every time we look, we find something that we didn't know before, and it really seems to play a role in a lot of disease processes that we had no idea of before. Even this week, there was a study that came out on Parkinson's disease, and Parkinson's disease as a disease of dual systems or something it was called. And the idea that there's a certain portion of the population that develops Parkinson's disease, especially early onset Parkinson's, that it actually, the neural effects and the hormone dysregulation actually seems to start in the gut and then go to the brain, or vice versa, but it definitely seems to play a role. So what we have to remember is there's more bacterial cells in the gut than there are human cells in the body, on the order of trillions, and multiple millions per square centimeter of gut of all different types. They help process fibrous foods. They help process, complex fatty acids and complex carbohydrates, and really play a role in our hormone regulation and level of inflammation too. So this carries on to several different concepts. Your gut microbiome is shaped by different things. So the bacteria that get introduced there when you're born is basically a sterile environment. And then the first time you take a meal, or the first time that you get your hand in your mouth, or get dirt in your mouth, you start to develop your gut microbiome. And then it continues to be developed by your diet, environment, and stress. And there's at least a couple studies that I have bookmarked that show that that higher fat, lower carbohydrate diet tends to produce healthier gut microbiome and healthier bacteria that work in a more synergistic fashion, as opposed to high carbohydrate foods that result in more gas and more inflammation in the gut. So if you feel bloated a lot, you probably are eating too many processed simple carbohydrates or sugar. It's also shaped by your environment. We all wash our hands from time, at different amounts, but you can't not get bacteria from your environment in all the time. Your immune system is processing this exposure all the time. And whether it decides that it's going to be a friend or a foe bacteria makes a big difference as to the level of inflammation that goes on whenever you eat something else or get exposed to something else. And it plays in the hormone balance as well. And then even stress has been correlated to increased levels of inflammation in the gut, which is connected to your circulatory system. So therefore it increases your level of systemic inflammation as well. Okay. They've also found that you've probably heard of like a genetic diet. And the idea behind that, I haven't seen a ton of good data behind that, and that's going to be hard to do because the premise of that is that everybody reacts differently. And I don't know how you, how you test that other than to prove that it's different. But the idea is out there, and there have been some preliminary studies that show that different people respond to different foods. And based on your ancestry, you may be able to process more carbohydrates or do better with that than other people. But in general, and especially with the standard American diet, the level of carbohydrates is far and above what any ancestral peoples or ethnicity ate, on the order of, on average, 65% for most Americans of their dietary calories come from food, where ancestrally, even the ones that had, a root-based diet or sweet potatoes, like in Asian countries, it was about 45% was the upper limit of what they ate as far as calories from carbohydrates. If you look at high carb versus low carb athletic diets, when they talk about those in exercise books or texts, they're talking about the difference between 15 to 25% on the low end versus 35 to 45% on the high carb diet. So even the high carb diet in that literature is lower than the normal carb diet for standard Americans and lower than the USDA's dietary recommendations for Americans. Okay, so along those lines, there's studies out there, and this is exactly what it sounds like, about people who had a handful of case reports of people who have actually been able to lose weight by getting fecal transplants from skinnier people who have a better gut microbiome. But they have been able to show this over and over again in mouse models, and it's actually pretty convincing data and literature that they put out there, that they have two genetically identical mice on the same diet. And they give one a fecal transplant from a skinny mouse and one from a bred or overfed mouse on a grain diet, and they can actually make them go back and forth. They can make a skinny mouse fat by transplanting fecal material, and they can make a fat mouse skinny. So it's kind of interesting stuff. If you're, if that piques your interest, I urge you to go read those studies. They've also, and we've known this for a while, but they've done a lot more investigation into gut neurology and the hormone production. So we know for a fact that about 95% of the serotonin in your body is actually produced in the gut. And so you can imagine that it's reasonable to think that there's a correlation between all of the neurological issues, especially things like anxiety and depression, psychosis, that are associated with serotonin or acetylcholine imbalances, how they could have a connection to gut. If this is chronically dysregulated in your gut, and 95% of it comes from your gut, then the correlation from a theoretical standpoint is there. They've directly linked, like I said, up to a study that I just saw that came out this week, things like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's disease, where a high carbohydrate, high sugar diet actually predisposes people to these both of these diseases. There's a group of nutrition physiologists out there and dietitians and people putting out some of this literature that are actually starting to refer to Alzheimer's as type 3 diabetes. So antibiotics are a big one too. Antibiotics, the issue is that you should avoid them at all costs unless you really, really need them, because most diseases, including pneumonia and UTIs and things like that, pharyngitis, go away on their own. But if you kill the bad bacteria, you can't not kill the good bacteria. And then we talked about avoiding sugar and carb-dense foods. What you do want to try and do is eat pre and probiotic foods. These are actually two different things. So prebiotic foods are things that give nutrition to the bacteria, the good bacteria in your gut. So it's things like not completely ripe bananas, things with a lot of fiber in them, versus probiotic foods that actually contain the bacteria. So fermented foods, things like kombucha, or actually different alcoholic products or kefir or things like that. Okay, different food for different people. Let's go along with the blood type diet. Yeah, so that's what they're talking about. That's one of those things, genetic predispositions, whether that's HLA and the immune markers that are on people's cells or blood type. There seems to be some mixed data on that. I can't really speak to it because I haven't read anything or seen anything that makes it conclusive yet. But yeah, that's kind of what they're talking about. Okay, so exercise, we're gonna kind of go through some of the stuff, make sure that we get close to time. So exercise has been shown to reduce stress. It improves performance, cognition, and stamina. None of that's news. But what they've been changing is what kind of exercise is good for people. That's always the question, right? What can I do to get the most bang for my buck? What can I do that's sustainable, that's not miserable? So functional training is a big one. Now, you don't necessarily have to go out and do CrossFit or anything like that. Some of those are a little bit intense, and some of the way that that's done about throwing around a lot of weight early on in training that doesn't give the months necessary for ligaments and bone structure to adapt, I think is potentially dangerous. But functional training, meaning lifting weights, carrying things around in a way that kind of mimics what the human body is designed to do, and to move around in your environment in a way that mimics natural motion, has really been a focus. High intensity interval training has also been a big focus. And there's actually even marathon and ultra marathon runners who do the majority of their training by high intensity interval training. And HIIT training has also been shown to be more efficacious in terms of decreasing blood pressure, resting heart rate, things like that, than low intensity, long duration exercise. The data out there, or the literature out there, seems to suggest that for overall longevity and health span, not lifespan, but health span benefit, resistance training seems to have a slight edge over cardiovascular training. And that obviously is more true in things like retaining muscle strength, bone density things, but even over lifespan longevity, it seems that resistance training or training that's like plyometric and combines the two has an edge over strictly cardiovascular training. And then this idea that it always comes into favor, goes out of favor, comes into favor, goes out of favor. No pain, no gain is what you have to do to get stronger, faster, better, or to maintain your health. And that's only partially true. You really probably only need to do exercise that pushes through, pain thresholds, or, going to failure or whatever it is, or go, beat a record about 10% of the time. The rest of the time, about 90% of your training can be moderate intensity, not low intensity, but should be moderate. So you can do it. It's not miserable, but it's difficult for you to carry on a conversation while you're doing it. There's different metrics for saying moderate exercise, but really you can spend 90% of your time in that zone, and to maintain or increase in, strength, endurance, stamina, really only about 10% of it has to be truly intense. Okay. And then again, the whole thing about exercise, it's like diet. You have to find something that you can do for the rest of your life. You're doing this or something similar until the day you die. I really like rowing and hiking in the outdoors. That has to do with my job anyway, so I have to practice that. But rowing is kind of a low impact thing that works about 90% of the muscles in your body, not some of your push muscles, but other than that, if you do some push-ups on the side, then it gets you there. But find something that you really like to do and that you can see yourself doing for the next 30 years. Diets and exercise plans can't stop. As soon as you stop, you're gonna go back to your baseline state. Okay. Sleep, I know we're getting close to the end here, but I do want to touch on some of this stuff. So the 8 hours thing is a myth. People need 6 to 9, depending on your physiology. So do some experimentation when you've got a day off and figure out what works best for you. If you naturally sleep 9 hours after you've caught up on sleep, then that's what you need. If you've caught up on sleep and you only need 6, then that's what you need, and kind of tailor your pattern to that. More importantly than the amount of sleep that you get has actually been shown to be sleep cycles. And these are these 90-minute rhythms that you see on that right top graph there. And it's more important that you get an adequate number and equivalent time of each of the phases of these sleep cycles. Seems to be more important than the actual hour number. So the repair mechanisms for your body, whether that's getting rid of the neurofibrillary tangles and plaques in your brain for Alzheimer's, or repairing precancerous cells or from sunburn or an injury, happens mostly in the deep cycles. And you notice that those, depending on your fatigue level, can start more earlier on. If you're really tired, then you'll find yourself dropping into those where you don't dream. If you find yourself doing a lot, then you're probably underslept. But then also the dreaming and the REM cycles are important. And they're important because it helps with dealing with stress. It helps with converting short to long-term memory and memory retention. But you'll notice with that graph that these REM cycles, which happen actually in a relatively lighter phase of sleep, get longer and longer as the night goes on. And so, you know, that late morning, as the sun's kind of coming up, sleep cycles are actually the most important. So you have to cut sleep somewhere, cut it late into the night, and make sure you're getting those later phases. Seems to make a difference, but you have to get an adequate number, about 5 cycles on average for people. So waking synchronization, in order to make that happen, to make sure you wake up in a lighter stage of sleep. If you wake up from a deeper stage of sleep, that's waking up on the wrong side of the bed. You feel fatigued throughout the day, you don't know why. Even if you got enough sleep, you woke up and you're just tired from the get-go, it's probably because you woke up in a deeper stage. So I use a sleep app, and it will kind of give you a window, and it will wait until it detects that you're in those lighter stages of sleep in order to wake you up. So that can be helpful too, especially if you're not allowing yourself to get a full night of sleep. If you know you can only get 5 or 5.5 hours, you know, setting one of those clocks, it might actually wake you up 10 or 15 minutes earlier than you otherwise would, but it does it before it allows you to get into a deeper stage, can be helpful. Sleep hygiene, we've heard about this, you know what it is, but you got to do it. You got to, if it's dark outside, it should be pretty dark in your house. Avoid screens, avoid blue light, go to bed at the same time every night. Try and get up at the same time every morning. That seems to be more important than going to bed at the same time every night. And all that stuff that you've seen. Night shift is hard. You should think about this in general as extreme jet lag, you know, a 12-hour offset, as if you had traveled somewhere around the world with a 12-hour offset from us. And the way to do that is to make your body, if you're on a series of nights, think that it's night. So you got to make your room dark. It's probably better if you make it cold, because it tends to be colder at night. Whether you want to take melatonin or something like that, I don't typically recommend anything stronger in particular to make yourself go to sleep. And then just as important, when you come off of night shifts, expose yourself to bright light, sunlight ideally, or they even make little glasses on your face that do it. Or little lamps at your bedside that wake you up with a sunrise over, 15, 20, 30 minutes, as opposed to a single alarm clock. But you want to, when you're getting off nights and back on a days, you want to make sure that you're exposing yourself as early as possible to bright light, and then throughout the day, and then you're getting dark or not exposing yourself to bright light as soon as it becomes dark outside. And that kind of stuff can help you to get better in sync and make that transition, but it's hard. How to fall asleep, there's different recommendations on it, as well as how to get back to sleep is different. I'm not going to really go into each of those just because for the sake of time, but there is a book that'll show up at the end too called Why We Sleep, that if this is a big thing for you, this was probably the most recent change that I've made in my life that seemed to help as far as health and wellness, because I kind of, going through medical school and emergency medicine, have dismissed it for a long time. But you can't go without this. It's one of the 3 legs of the health stool that you got to sit on. So without it, it's gonna collapse. You got to do this stuff. So question, Apple Watch, legit regarding sleep cycles. I don't know about the Apple Watch, but I think some of those, I think they're all generally pretty good. There's an app that I use called, it's called the Sleep Cycle app, and that one is pretty good too. In general, they'll do it one of 2 ways or both. So the ones that you wear on your wrist or the apps will either listen to your breathing, and they'll actually record and tell you if you're snoring as well, in which case you might have to worry about something like sleep apnea, or they'll record motion. And so the premise behind that is during very deep sleep, your breathing is slow and shallow and regular. And you also can't move. Your body is effectively paralyzed. So if it notices movement in any large degree, then you're not in your very deep sleep stage. And it'll time those different phases. And then, if you wake up 20 minutes before your alarm is supposed to go off, noted by more rapid breathing or irregular breathing or more motion, then it'll actually wake you up at that time, as opposed to waiting until you get back into a later stage of sleep. So Apple Watch specifically, I can't necessarily speak to, but in general, they're pretty good. And it's better than, an alarm clock that just screams at you at exactly 5 o'clock. Okay, so meditation. It's not what you think. There's a bunch of forms. It's not necessarily sitting on a rock and chanting. It's really about finding me time, whatever that is for you. Some people use exercise, gardening. It doesn't have to be doing nothing, but the premise is that you really have to disconnect. You have to pull yourself away from social media and TV and the modern lifestyle, and allow yourself to have open thoughts and me time. It's not forced. It's not about driving thoughts out of your head. You allow thoughts to come in, a stressful thing, whatever, and then you allow them to go out. You address them and then move on. It's not about focusing only on your breathing or focusing only on chanting or anything like that. You can't fight it, but as you practice and go through it more and more and do it more and more often, you'll find it easier to disconnect your brain and not perseverate over these thoughts. It seems to be easier for people to get into it if you do it first thing in the morning, the last thing at night. That's when your brain and your hormones are more in tune with like a neutral mode or neutral gear, so to speak. And so it is a little bit easier if you try and do that. And it kind of gets you either on the right foot going into your day or on the right foot so you can go to sleep and sleep more soundly at night. And then again, there's apps and classes. I recommend those to get started. There's a Calm app that's really good, and they have different guided meditations. They have white noise. They have all different kinds of cool stuff that you can go through to at least get you started, and then you'll go practice it on your own. Oops. Question, any good books or websites on healthy lifestyle specifically for night shift workers? Oh, that's a good one. I don't know about night shift specifically, but that Why We Sleep book does touch on that for at least a chapter or so. So I would recommend that one as a place to start with. I don't know about a whole book just on night shift workers, but at the end of the presentation, I am going to throw up a slide of some of the major ones I recommend. And again, if this is something that people are into, then I can throw up all those studies, and I have a list of 70 other books if you guys really want to get into it, but that'll take you a while to get through. It's taken me years to get through. So, all right. So the last little thing I want to touch on very briefly, because it's a huge topic, but it's something that's come up a lot, is this in more recent literature, is this concept of epigenetics. And so we used to think that your predisposition for diabetes or cancer or heart disease, or how long you have to sleep or what kind of food you're supposed to eat, is dictated by your chromosomes. And to a degree it is, but there's actually this mechanism in your body called epigenetics, in which histones and methylation of different strands of the DNA and how it's wrapped, in chromatin and all these different components about how DNA is actually packaged and exposed to the proteins that code it, actually determine how much it's expressed. So you may have a code for, or a predisposition for diabetes, for example. But if you eat a high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet, then that gene that predisposes you to insulin resistance more rapidly than somebody else may never actually get expressed. And so if it's never expressed, no matter what your predisposition to diabetes or cancer or anything is, it will never actually be manifested. And this is interesting because that idea means that it's theoretically possible to alter your own genetic expression in some aspects on some genes to a certain degree by what you do. And that's a very interesting concept, that your behavior can actually determine what genes are expressed. So they call it the on-off switch for different genes. And the reason that's important, the only reason that I bring it up, and I encourage you guys to look into it a little bit more, is that epigenetics seems to sometimes carry from generation to generation. So things like a predisposition to diabetes may actually be the result of epigenetic factors that were activated or deactivated in previous generations. So if everybody in your family seems to get fat easily, and I say that because I know that's true for mine, and I was too. I was 285 pounds at one point. It's not necessarily the fact that it's programmed in your genes. It may actually be the fact that your mother and her father had some really bad health habits, or they listened to the USDA and had a low-fat diet. And, therefore the expression on certain genes has been upregulated or downregulated to a degree where now everyone in subsequent generations has this predisposition of this problem. It probably can be reversed, but sometimes, the problem with epigenetics is whether it's methylation or, some of the other processes, changes can happen on the order of months to years to decades to generations, and it varies from which gene you're talking about. So, it can take a long time to turn around some of these changes, but keep in mind that the choices that you're making today not only affect you now, they can affect what happens and what's expressed and what your cancer risk is 20 or 30 years from now. And it can affect what, your children and grandchildren have as far as risk for these diseases. So this is a very new topic, but it's very interesting because it has a lot of implications. Okay. So summary, very briefly, I know we're a few minutes over here, but the stress and, these obstacles or challenges that we have to wellness are most likely or most heavily coming from our modern life and this disconnect from our ancestral lifestyle. That positive psychology leads to resilience and leads to overall better wellness no matter what you're actually exposed to. That your discomfort or that pain is inevitable. You're going to be exposed to stress, but suffering as a result of that stress is a choice, and it has a lot to do with your mindset going into, during, and after a situation. You have to identify your purpose in life, your purpose in your job, and that gets you through a lot of this stuff. You have to find an outlet for meditation, for mindfulness, to disconnect from modern society. Find what works for you. It doesn't matter what it is. I recommend something in nature, but in general, just find what your jam is and make sure that you make time to do that. This idea of metacognition this is thinking about how we think and how we think plays into our physical life and our overall wellness and our overall health. And then this nutrition, exercise, sleep access, you really got to nail down all of these three things in order to have good health as much as possible. You can't take out any one of these and consider yourself or become healthy in the long term. And that you actually should eat more healthy fat. I really encourage you guys to read some of those books that I put up and investigate this. It's super counterintuitive. It was for me. I had to get through 5 of those books before I really bought it. It seemed like they were trying to sell another diet or something, but you read more and more and more, and then you actually go dig into some of these studies that they talk about, and they're right. The data is there. It's just there's so much historical and political and financial backing behind our current system that this change is going to be a very slow, painful one. But I recommend it. It works for my friends, my family, and my wife's patients and my own. So look into it. And then make sure that you're connecting to patients and those that you work with. That'll make your wellness level increase as well. And then just slow down with your life. Take time for yourself, take time to do this other stuff. Without taking time, slowing down, and and taking care of yourself, you're not going to be as effective, and you're not going to be able to practice any degree of wellness. So, all right, that's it. So these are the books. I'll put them up, and I'll leave myself open to questions if anybody else has anything right now. Let's see. I can look in the chat here stuff too. That's my email address. If you need anything, I'll go back to that book slide so you can take a picture of it or jot it down. Oh, there's stuff coming up in the chat. Okay. So let's listen again. Okay, cool. Yeah, so read those books, and then if there's enough demand, I can send out those studies. It's a lot of stuff to get through. Like I said, I'm in the process of creating a website called ancestralhuman.com. Dr. Pennington, who's on today, is helping me with that, as well as my wife. She knows as much about this stuff as I do. So look for that in the near future, maybe the next month or two. Right now, it's kind of just like a template website, but I'm going to put all this stuff up, and I can send it out to as far as the lecture or the lectures that we've done, the studies, and the books on nutrition, because there's 70 more where this came from. All right. Thank you, guys.
That's great, Dr. Archambeau. Thank you so much. That was an amazing presentation. We are going to work on having the webinars available for those of you that attended. So not quite sure what that's going to look like, if we're going to post it up on the Facebook page or email a link out to the attendees, but stand by and we will figure out what the best way to do that is through technology. Other than that, I think we are going to wrap it up for today. Thank you so much, everybody who attended. That's 3 out of 4. We got one more coming next week. So make sure you get registered for that webinar and have a great day.